It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Smiles all round. Better than expected growth gives the Chancellor a much-needed boost. But will it last? The Tories don't think so.
These figures, of course, don't capture the effect of people actually paying these national insurance increases that businesses are being affected by.
If we hit zero in November, then police cannot make arrests, courts can't hold trials, and the whole system then collapses.
If prisons are full, should we have shorter jail terms? And could Britain send failed asylum seekers to countries like Albania? Joining us today, Labour MP Catherine Atkinson, Conservative MP Luke Evans, Parth Patel from the left-leaning think tank the IPPR, and Madeline Grant from the Daily Telegraph. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Let's start with this story headlined in the Daily Telegraph. Net zero will not bring electricity prices down, says British gas boss. Energy giant's owner casts doubt on Labour's promise to lower household energy bills. Let's have a little look at what Chris O'Shea went on to say in full when it comes to net zero policies. The build-out of renewables will not materially reduce UK electricity prices from current levels. They may give price stability and avoid future price spikes based on the international gas market, but they will definitely not reduce the price. He goes on to talk about his frustration. I fully support the move to a cleaner energy system. I am simply very frustrated that people peddle misinformation at best and disinformation at worst. This is in stark contrast to what the government repeatedly said during the elections, and that is that energy bills will come down. That's been reiterated by the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, who says, again, £300 lower for people's energy prices. Who's right, Catherine?
Well, the reason we need to have clean British energy by 2030 is to get off the roller coaster of dependence on fossil fuels and actually give some security back to our energy system. And I think it's clear he does acknowledge we do need to move to renewables. Look, I can understand maybe an energy boss not wanting to make that commitment, but this government is absolutely clear that we are determined to bring energy prices down.
Right, well, he's not shy, though, is he, in coming forward? He calls it misinformation that renewable energy will bring down costs for households. Do you want to correct the record, or do you think he's wrong?
The government has been absolutely clear that it is determined to bring down and will bring down our prices.
So he's wrong.
Well, I think that you can understand maybe he's a boss of an energy company, maybe that's the position he wants to take, but he does agree that it is essential that we do move to renewable energy. It's something that we simply cannot afford not to do.
Yes, I mean, he does, in that sense, totally undermine Kemi Baden, not the Conservative Party's policy, which is to at least cast doubt on net zero policies, because he says we must do it. We must move to greener energy. So in that sense, the government is absolutely right.
I disagree. The Stone Age didn't finish because they ran out of stones. It was technology that innovated us and brought us forward. The issue we have here is the disinformation. We didn't hear it mentioned today, and I'd be interested to see if Catherine would commit.
He calls it misinformation, but anyway, yeah.
Well, the £300 commitment was made time and time again to the electorate, and yet it hasn't materialised. If anything, with the cap, it's now gone up by £281.
We are 10 months in. It was a commitment by the end of this term in Parliament.
It hasn't been committed to again on the floor of the House because you know it's not deliverable, and you've got an energy boss saying exactly that. I think everyone agrees we need to get there because we need our better security, we need better environment, but it's the affordability. And this is what Tony Blair said. There's a credibility gap here when it comes to the Energy Secretary. What does he actually believe? What is he trying to do?
He did say, Tony Blair wasn't specifically talking about Ed Miliband, but he may have been included in it.
Our fossil fuel markets are controlled by dictators. It is absolutely essential.
Is Norway a dictator?
It's essential that we actually have British homegrown energy.
Who's right, Parth, in your mind, Chris O'Shea or Ed Miliband?
Ed Miliband, hands down. I'm sorry, Chris O'Shea's analysis there, I'm afraid, is just completely out of date. And people that make arguments that Chris are making usually are doing it from a point of interest rather than evidence-based argument.
Catherine was trying to say that, yeah.
Which is that, look, we've got a boss of a fossil fuel energy company saying the future is fossil fuels. On the other hand, you've got a Secretary of State of a democratically elected government whose primary responsibility is to the British government and is acting in the service of the common good. So, I mean, look, given that we're here, I think what Desnes is trying to do two things. It's trying to reduce bills and it's trying to slow climate breakdown. I think the interesting thing that Ed Miliband is doing is he's trying to think about that in a joined up way. That's new because I think he's clocked onto something that I think is one of the great puzzles of our time, something that other people I wish were spending more time to solve, which is why when the price of renewables has collapsed, we're not using them more. We've all seen the same charts. Solar, drop. Wind, in one of the windiest countries in the world, is so much cheaper than it was. It's cheaper now than so many fossil fuels, and yet we're not using them more. That's got to change, and I think that's what Ed Miliband and the government is trying to do.
Right. I mean, Madeleine, it's interesting that Path believes believes Ed Miliband wholeheartedly, and not Chris Shea saying that the retail price of electricity is not going to come down anytime soon. Who do you believe?
Well, I mean, I guess I have my own view on this, which is basically that I think there's been a real absence of honesty from the whole debate about net zero from the very beginning. I understand why Chris O'Shea makes this point, because I think there is a problem of credibility. You've got to bring people with you. And also, I think it is significant that the Labour Party before the election was making this pledge about 300 quid a year off bills and now has not committed to it since, because they know it's impractical. But there does come a problem if people are repeatedly told one thing and it never manifests itself. I mean, from the beginning, net zero went through Parliament with minimal debate and without any kind of vote. And it's almost as if we are only belatedly beginning to realise the true costs, which I think are sometimes not reflected. For example, your point, which is absolutely true about, in some cases, that the wholesale price is decreasing. I don't feel that we capture the amount of government subsidies that has gone into renewables in order to get it to that place. It is often just compared against things like gas without any of that context about the amount of money it took in government spending and taxpayer spending to get it to that point.
Yes,
we need to be realistic, and also you alienate people if you lie to them and then change the terms of reference after the event.
But we have also seen thousands of new jobs in clean energy. We've seen tens of billions of pounds of private investment in this industry. And someone will be at the forefront of green technologies. It should be Britain.
But Unite Union came out, their boss turned around and said, we need someone who believes in Britain, and it's not Ed Miliband. So, I mean, it's not just the power companies that are saying it. Yeah. It is the complete other side of the spectrum. The union's saying, have we really got this balance right? For me, that's the issue. It's this idea of security, environment and affordability. And the worry is, as Tony Blair is pointing to, is that the affordability is falling on the backs of those who can't afford it. When we see winter fuel payment take away, when we see the bills go up, that has an impact on people and they won't come with you. And that's the worry.
I think the first half of what was said there is actually the answer to the puzzle I set out. Is the reason we haven't shifted from expensive fossil fuels to cheaper renewables is partly because the profit margins are much higher on fossil fuels and there are entrenched interests in keeping that industry as it is. But we're in a time of great disruption. And
the profit levy is 78%.
Can I just say something? We have diversified and moved towards renewables at a faster rate than almost any other country in the world, and yet we have still exceptionally high energy costs. We have, I think, uniquely high energy costs in Europe. So, you know, by that calculation, we ought to have seen the prices come down, but instead the opposite has happened.
Well, let's just go to the prices again, because for people watching and for people who were following the election last year, as I said, the government said repeatedly that energy bills would come down by £300. Can you just clarify what that actually meant? Did it mean that energy bills will be £300 cheaper than they are now, or £300 cheaper than they would otherwise have been?
We are 10 months in, and I think that I absolutely agree that we have to be bringing energy bills down, and that is going to be the proof in the pudding. But it takes time to break from the fossil fuel roller coaster that we are in, and that is why it's been so important to see the investment that we've had.
Because if I was watching and if I had read that in the manifesto, I would have understood it that they will be £300 cheaper than I am paying now. This is Keir Starmer. Labour's first step to set up Great British Energy will save families up to £300 a year off their energy bills. You will be better off, it says. People are not better off, all right, not 10 months in, but when will they really be better off?
It's a manifesto commitment to deliver in this Parliament, and we do have to bring those energy bills down. Yeah. But it is still
so they
taking
could go
time
much
and
higher.
investment.
They could go much, much higher, and then it will be £300 cheaper.
We have to put the investment in, and we've seen the private investment already. We've seen the jobs. I've got 200 new jobs in my constituency in valence manufacturing. So I think that there is a lot that we're seeing up and down the country. But expecting it to everything to be done in the first year of a Labour government. These things do unfortunately take time.
All right, well, there was some good news for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, in terms of the growth figures. Economy grew by 0.7%, to the surprise of many, in the first 3 months of the year, and she says it's down to government policies. They're working.
We are set to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 in the first 3 months of this year. That reflects some of the decisions that we have made, the choices that we have made. Brought stability back to the economy, which has enabled the Bank of England to cut interest rates 4 times, increasing the national living wage to give millions of working people a pay rise. And of course, just last week we secured 2 significant trade deals with the US and India.
Luke, you must be delighted that the UK is having the fastest growth in the G7.
It is fantastic because we're back to where we handed over as Conservatives, when we had the fastest growing economy. It was 0.7%. I think so. It is good news. Look, we want Britain to be growing, absolutely, but lift the bonnet. And that's when you start to see something really different. Inflation is still high. When we handed over it was at target. But also, more worryingly, is what's going on in the jobs market. So you're seeing a quarter of businesses turn around and say they're going to release people. We've seen unemployment go up by 10%. So in my patch, it's gone up by 10% since last year. In Catherine's patch, it's gone up by 4%. These are real impacts that are going to hit people. And we haven't even had the toxic concoction yet of the NICS increase, the living wage increase, and the unemployment bill that's coming forward that's going to cost businesses a huge amount. When that hits, that's not factored in yet. And I haven't even mentioned tariffs, that will be factored in as well. So there's a lot going on here.
Catherine?
Well, it is absolutely right to celebrate being the fastest growing in the G7 when you're growing faster than the US, France and Germany. And it is fantastic to see Rachel Reeves in my home city in Derby, where she was a year ago setting out Labour's economic plan, and to have fix the foundations, to be cutting red tape, to be ensuring that we have that investment is really important. And to have had the interest rate cuts that we have seen and wages going up faster than prices, these are steps in the right direction. A lot more to do still, but steps in the right direction.
I mean, do you think she is right to be happy about the government's policies working?
Well, I think she's right to be happy, because Rachel Reeves has had a pretty torrid time of it since she became Chancellor, and there was a great deal of discontentment from different areas of her party for different reasons, and the cuts to disability have created a great rupture towards the left of the party. So there is a lot going on, and of course Rachel Reeves will talk up these figures. I do think there's a danger of getting a bit over the top about the significance of them, for the reasons that Luke mentions, but also because there does seem to be a general pattern in the way that when we announce these data points. The first one of the year tends to be much higher, and it's been that case since 2022. Q1 tends to, for whatever reason, perform significantly better. I think this time last year it was 0.9%, and then obviously declined thereafter. So this seasonality element, I don't really know what the reason is. Perhaps Parth, who's a proper economist, I'm not even someone. I have an English degree. But this seasonality is a real thing, and I wonder if it's something that may need to be factored into the discussions. Perhaps there's a danger of overselling, but I understand why Rachel Reeves is trying to do this, because she's been getting it in the neck from all sides of her party recently and is very unpopular with the general public.
Parth?
Yeah, I think we probably do have to give the government some credit here, because I mean, most of this growth, this 0.7%, it's not a figure we usually are used to seeing around UK growth figures, is about a rise in investment. And the number one plank the government has made about its growth strategy is growing investment. And I mean, when we look back to the autumn budget, most of the sort of mood music, the conversations on the back of that were like, well, that was a bit of a disaster. But I mean, was it? The most significant element of that budget were the changes to the fiscal rules. That has lifted the lid on government investment in industries of tomorrow, investing in the infrastructure. And that has allowed private investment to come in as well. That might be what we're seeing. It might be. It's not certain. So I think this is a step in the right direction, and it's good and positive news. But data has this mischievous sort of trick of often misleading us.
Well, putting the data... yeah, sorry, go on, Luke.
No, I was just going to changing the fiscal rules for the public means that we saw a tax rise of £40 billion. We saw a borrowing of £30 billion to create £70 billion worth of spending. I'm not sure we've seen that return yet. I mean, what's been missed today is the NHS waiting lists have crept up. That's something in my department that
they had come down, of course.
Yeah, they had come down. They're creeping
6
back
months
up.
in a row.
So where's the money going on that basis? We're going to have the national insurance hits for GPs, care homes, hospices. These kind of things are going to have a real big impact on the likes of pubs, cafes, up and down the country. So I'm cautiously pleased this is happening, but there's a reality of what will come to bite, and that's what the public will see.
I mean, data is, of course, important and central, but it's also about how people feel, Path. Yeah. And I don't think people feel that their living standards are going up. Again, it may be too soon, but if you have a look at this in the eye, the price of butter, chocolate, coffee and potatoes soars and costs will go higher. People are right to ask themselves, why don't I feel better off?
Yeah, I mean, that's true because they're not. I think that's the plain fact of it. And there is always this degree of separation here between sort of aggregate GDP figures, which I think are largely speaking a pointless debate that we have again and again and again.
Not too pointless.
And the thing that matters, which is that, and I know we're going to be talking about the EU and the potential trade deals, but the price of eggs and butter, if you want them to come down, your most obvious instrument there is to strike a better deal with the places you import them from.
It is how people feel. And I do think that while we saw last month people's wages going up and the minimum wage went up and pensions went up while the costs weren't going up as fast. But it will take time for that accumulate and for people to really feel it. But certainly I'm seeing it in Derby, not just in Rolls-Royce where Rachel Reeves was, which has seen a fantastic £9 billion deal, the biggest in its history with the government when it comes to the nuclear reactors for our submarines. But we're also seeing a brand new market hall reopening this weekend in Derby, filled with fantastic local businesses. We're getting a new business school. We're seeing investment in our theatres. We're seeing real differences. A new 3,500 capacity music venue. That's a difference I'm seeing in my city. And I want to build on that because there is so much more to do.
Luke?
Sorry, what's the question?
Well, in terms of responding, it all sounds bright, sunny uplands.
Well, I gently point out that we've seen that's all very well, but if you're one of the 4% increase who's just lost their job in your constituency, that's going to have an impact. That's what I worry about in my area. I'm very lucky that unemployment is low in my area, but I'm of course worried about what that would look like. And if you listen to what the business surveys have said, with a quarter of people looking at making redundancies, this is a worry. This is going to be the reality. I hope I'm wrong, actually, but all the indicators on that basis pointing towards the fact there's going to be problems, and that will hit people in their pockets. And on top of that, the forecasts that we are talking about have all been downgraded since the budget and since the emergency budget. That's not just one, the OBR, that's the IMF, that's the OECD. These are all saying that there are problems here, and we haven't even talked about the wider international impacts.
Well,
yet.
let's pick up on
pick
up on the budget later on this year with this headline in the Times. Rachel Reeves will be forced to raise taxes, says ex-Number 10 aide. Autumn budget is Chancellor's last chance to make meaningful change before the next election, says Nick Williams, and he is talking about this autumn. It's honest, isn't it, to say that taxes will have to go up?
I mean, Rachel Reeves has been absolutely clear about our fiscal rules because we know what happens when we end up with things like trusts, and a lot of mortgages are still feeling the ramifications.
So taxes will have to go up?
No, I think we've done a lot to raise the money that we needed for the £26 billion that went into our NHS. And while we will regularly get the Conservatives kind of complaining about the really difficult decisions that had to be made, but they won't say they'll reverse them, and they won't say how they'd pay to keep up the kind of investment we desperately need to fix our public services that were left on their knees after 14 years of Conservative government.
Right, but he is a former economic advisor to the Chancellor. He would know, wouldn't he, if he thinks taxes are necessary. Now, look, it was the, let's put it this way, dishonesty of both main parties at the election to say that taxes wouldn't have to rise to deal with some of the endemic problems. And now he is saying they'll have to go up this autumn.
I don't accept that. I think that the Labour were really, really clear about taxes not going up in people's paychecks because it was so important that we aren't, when people are facing what we have seen, cost of living crisis for so long that we inherited, that we were making sure that while we do need to fix the public finances, we also need to make sure our public services are fixed too.
And that is what people voted for.
I think that's a bit insincere, really, to say that it wasn't felt in the paychecks. I mean, most economists think that, I think something like 75% of the increase to employers' NI is passed on to the worker. I think it was a bit of linguistic sophistry by Rachel Reeves, and people can see through it. Again, back to the point what I made earlier about deceit in politics, and we've had an awful lot of deceit in politics over recent years, and it's not a good way. You can't trick the electorate like that, I don't think.
Well, and that's why the Conservatives were punished.
Well, exactly. But I think Rachel Reeves did something very similar in pretending that this didn't affect employees at all, and that it would simply be borne by the. That's not how business works.
I mean, again, if honesty is important, Path, there surely has to be a discussion about taxes going up later this year. If you've got your fiscal rules, you're not going to break those, and maybe you cut spending further than she has set out, but you will still have to raise taxes.
Potentially, very potentially, of course, we'll see taxes go up. But I mean, the problem I have with this discussion is that it feels a bit upside down. What we know, and we're about to come on to this, is our public services are in desperate need of investment. Yeah. We need to find a way to put more money into the NHS, into the criminal justice system. The question is how, right? So part of that might be tax. We're certain that borrowing is going to go up. But one thing that is new about the state and the role of the state today is it's been drawn into the job of growing the economy. And they've been drawn into that job because markets are not doing it. It used to be the case that as long as the state respected the market and provided it with skilled workers, growth would take care of itself. For the past 15 years, that has not been true. And what we're seeing at the moment is a degree of innovation in policy making and economic policy making in countries like the UK with a long history of a hands-off approach to the economy, putting their hands back onto the steering wheel with industrial policy, with investment, with public ownership over some industries, with increasing regulation in some areas, but pulling back regulation in other areas. And I think that's why the Chancellor should take some confidence from the statistics today. She should be emboldened in her approach in sort of the autumn budget and go the next step further. There's a new role of the state, there's a new role of the market, and there's a new nature of the correct relationship between the two of them.
Growth is the number one priority, the number one mission for this government, and it is being proactive.
Well, then why,
in being able to
raise national insurance contributions on employers then, if it is the number one? I thought you said it was public services and repairing those as being...
No, it's got to be both.
Okay.
It's got to be both.
And it's inclusive.
And it's how we pay for things is ensuring we have the growth.
Another part of the state of the public sector that desperately needs some investment, BBC News headline, more inmates released early to stop prisons running out of space. This is plans announced by or outlined by the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood yesterday. And she wants to see offenders spending 1 to 4 years who are recalled to prison for breaching their licences will be released after 28 days. Good idea, Madeleine?
It's hard to say, but I do think that I was quite disappointed by what the Justice Secretary said, because the thing that struck me is that she says, we can't build our way out of this crisis, we can't build enough prisons too. This seems to me like a real paucity of ambition, you know, that she's saying actually we have to release people early, even if people who are perhaps going on to reoffend, and that creates all kinds of social problems. Why can't we build more prisons? You know, I'm sure that in the austerity years, Cameron and Osborne would have said we can't build more prisons because we inherited a financial mess. In hindsight, that decision looks ridiculously short-sighted and counterproductive. So, you know, what explains this narrowing of horizons?
Well, perhaps this will help explain it. The Ministry of Justice Interim Permanent Secretary, who was standing with Shabana Mahmood, Amy Rees, was clear on how our prisons have ended up in this state. Let's have a listen.
The primary cause of this is clear. Sentence lengths have increased considerably. In 2005, the average custodial sentence was 13 months. By 2023, it was 21 months, a 66% increase. We now have a larger population of sentenced prisoners in our prisons serving longer sentences than they used to.
Luke, is she right?
Well, she's the expert. I assume she must be right.
Right, so sentences are too long.
Well, when I came into Parliament, we all agree we need more prison places. I don't think that's the bottom line. So when we came into government, or certainly when I did, there was a £4 billion plan to bring forward prisons. We've seen one open in 2022, 1,700 places. We've seen another one open in Leicestershire in 2023. We've just seen one open in York in March. Now we hear the government saying there are 3 more. Are those new 3 prisons, or were they the ones from our plan to make these spaces? I'd be interested, Catherine, if you know.
Catherine, respond.
Absolutely. And I think that the net increase of prison places under the last 14 years of Conservative government was less than 500, because you were shutting more than you were building, whereas the previous Labour government put in place more than 28,000 prison places. I was a barrister for 17 years. I've been campaigning on justice issues for over over a decade. And I have seen not just our courts literally falling down, but we have seen our prisons left in crisis and the violence in our prisons escalate year on year.
So are you going to campaign for a prison in your constituency?
So we are getting... she's already announced 3 more prisons, but
they're the ones we announced, aren't they? Or are they new ones?
But didn't deliver. So I think that what's
3?
really important is that we not only need to build, because we do, and we do need additional prison places.
But I think everyone agrees you need more prison places. Let's talk about the actual sentences. That's what Amy Rees was talking about.
And they have pretty much doubled in the last 20 years.
Right.
But that is why David Gauke is leading a sentencing review. But we have to tackle reoffending. And actually, if you put people into prisons and they come out just as better criminals, then that is not doing a really important part of our justice system.
Right. So are prison sentences too long?
Yes, they are. Commit a robbery today, on average, you're going to get about a 13-month longer sentence than if you committed the exact same robbery 10 years ago. So something's happened, prison sentences have gotten too long, and this is the #1 cause of why the prison population in England and Wales has doubled over the past 30 years, even though crime rates have fallen dramatically. So there is something going on here. And I mean, the way I sometimes think about this is just because I used to work in them, is that we've run out of prison places and kind of think about that in the way, why we run out of hospital places? And those sorts of things, there's no prison places left, there's no hospital places left. They're emblematic of a system that is, rotten and in deep need of reform all the way down. So yes, this is about we don't have enough prison places, but you peel that back and it's about backlogs in the courts, which mean that 1 in 5 prisoners today is there because they're just waiting to be tried or sentenced. 1 in 5 prisoners. You've got the lengthening prison sentences, which mean that people are just spending much longer in there. You've got a probation service that's down on his knees, so that when people go out, they're much more likely to break the terms of the parole, and so they're going back in. There's so many layers here that are overlapping and intersecting, but the problem, the thing I'm trying to point out here is that this is a crisis that's been brewing for so long, and the buck has to stop with politicians. It's a political failure because it's the outcome of political decisions. And I'm sorry to say, Luke, it has been largely during that long period of Conservative governments, not just of austerity, because prison services and probation services were cut quite dramatically, but also because we've known for maybe at least 5 years prison spaces are about to run out unless we did something dramatically different. Did we do anything dramatically different? No.
Well, we built but going back to it...
Let's stick on the sentences,
no, absolutely. So you're going to tell me that the public want softer sentences? What about the victims that you're just talking about? Those victims of crimes do not want to see those perpetrators have their sentence shortened. No, there's a real conflict there of how we solve that issue. Because they, at the end of the day, both parties believe that victims should be at the centre of this. So they're really going to feel hard done by if their domestic violence or stalker is released out on the streets. And the way it was done by the last government, the government just... earlier this year, we saw that people were released without tags, that people went on to reoffend. There was champagne in the streets. I'm not making those stories up. They happen. So I think of the victims in this, of what they look like.
And so do I, and have a great deal of sympathy with that argument. But I think, look, we're in a position where we are now rationing prison places because we're worried that we're going to run out of them. So there are no easy choices here. It's just trade-offs. There's a hard choice and there's an even harder choice. And to be honest, the Secretary of State has probably got the most difficult job in government.
And I think that we did see Conservative government bearing their head in the stand on this issue. Even before COVID, we had record waiting lists when it came to the court delays. And we had a complete mess made of probation where they privatised a whole chunk of it, fractured it into 21 different companies. They kind of went bust and they had to bring it back in. They've made a mess of probation and there is a lot of work to do to ensure that we have secure probation.
You've had 14 years then. You're an expert in this area. Where is the plan that's come forward? The Secretary of State has now just announced the same as the Conservatives were doing. I'm struggling to see what the plan was over 14 years. So but suddenly you've had almost a year in power now, 10 months. The election was next week, called next week. What does that look like? Why aren't we seeing a plan that's rolled out immediately? Because we know the urgency of it.
I think there has been a plan from the beginning. Shabana, our Justice Secretary, was faced with an absolute crisis in prisons as soon as she took the position of Justice Secretary. And the reason that they put in the sentencing review, because it is absolutely essential that we do have evidence-based planning to make sure that victims stay the priority, that they actually have access to justice quickly, that they're not waiting 3-4 years before their trial, and that they have confidence that actually people will be safer at the end.
And we're expecting that sentencing review by David Gauke, I think, actually next week. But Madeleine, can you make an argument? Can politicians make an argument? Luke saying that actually the public want people locked up possibly for longer, and Parth saying actually we have increased sentences over the last decade. Can you make an argument to the public that is compelling enough to say that actually shorter sentences would work?
I think it's politically very difficult because, you know, and I completely agree with much of what we have said so far about the state of the court system. And there is also, I think, a feeling of a growing lawlessness in the UK where certain crimes have been essentially legalised in practice and very little is done for so-called minor crimes, which are in fact anything but minor. And I think the police force is facing perhaps its worst crisis of my lifetime in terms of the consent that traditionally enables it to do its job. I think in this context of a real mistrust between public and the authorities, it will be very hard to spin this as anything other than we don't care, we are letting people out early, especially because many of the people who have been incarcerated, it's often, you know, it's not their first offence. They would have committed an offence like maybe 10 times before they actually end up getting a proper custodial sentence. So I think it will be very hard to sell this. And it's also, I think, different from what people obviously voted hoping for a change. I don't think they thought that change would look like letting people out early and not building enough prisons.
Can you make that argument, Catherine?
I think we do need to ensure that we have the prison places that we need, and we need to ensure that dangerous criminals are locked up and the public is safe. That's absolutely got to be priority. But we also need to ensure that people aren't just in cycles of reoffending. We need to try and give the training and the skills and to stop people reoffending and to get their lives back on track so that we are all safer. And proper community sentences, proper investment in prisons and probation can break those cycles.
Right. I mean, do you agree now that prison doesn't work, really, because of the cycle of reoffending?
Well, there's clearly... That's a yes and no answer. I think of it a little bit like, if we put my medical hat on, how do we get people to be healthier and fitter? There's a similar principle here. Actually, you want to look at the root causes. So I do a lot of work on steroids, for example, and we know that there's been a massive increase in steroids use in prisons and within reoffending. One of the meetings I'm trying to get with the Justice Secretary is to be able to have that conversation. Can we do some trials to then get people out? We know if people are using steroids, they're more likely to commit domestic violence, for example. So there's ways of looking at the root causes to get there in the first place. But I do not want to see the likes of paedophiles or rapists out on the streets. I'm very clear on that. I think the public are very clear on that. So it's how we rehabilitate those in the middle, the reoffenders and the low-level crime side. And I'm happy to see the evidence and be led by that on how we do it.
I think one point that needs to be made also is that there is a small number of criminals who cannot be rehabilitated. They will continue to go out and offend and make life impossible for their neighbours. The state needs to do something about those people. There have been an astonishing number of attacks on prison office staff. It's become, I've lost count of the number. It's not just Salman Abedi. I think it's Salman Abedi, the perpetrator of the Manchester Arena bombing, who was allowed to get hot oil and
water, I think,
was it hot water? There was someone
so,
else had hot oil.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm getting them muddled because there are so many.
No.
I think there were 3 stories like this in the last 24 hours. There also, I think, there is a retention recruitment crisis in the prison system.
Well,
so you need to make sure people are properly protected, or no one will want to work in the prison.
Well, I mean, that perhaps is the other side of that coin. Is
Absolutely.
That you can't get there. Inexperienced, you know, young, haven't been working very long in prisons and dealing with these sorts of incidents.
Absolutely, that's spot on. I think there's a real crisis in the prison workforce, and that needs to be tackled head on. And I mean, just so we are clear what we're talking about here, we are talking about basically the most fundamental job of the state, which is to keep the public safe. And I think what the Justice Secretary is doing, and when I said she had hard trade-offs, she doesn't want to get to the situation where she's at Christmas and we can't lock up someone who's committed a serious offence. And that would be a total breakdown of law and order. We have to do everything we possibly can to avoid a lawless Christmas. And I think that's why what's happening is happening. The immediate term, there's only tough situations. I think the big question is, will the government prioritise this in the way they prioritise the NHS? We're going to stop people falling ill. We're going to stop people committing crimes. We're going to stop people going to hospital. We're going to stop people going to prisons. That would be a genuine agenda for social policy in 2025.
All right, well, we have this sentencing review coming out next week by David Gork. In the meantime, let's talk about the much heralded UK-EU reset. It's been quite a build-up politically to this, with a summit early next week and big promises of much better relations and a better deal with the EU for Britain. Well, Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, can tell us how big a moment is this, Chris?
Yeah, hello, Jo Co. It is a moment. There's no doubt about it. It's had quite a trail, and the government having to walk something of a line between its instinct, which is a closer relationship with the EU within the confines that they've set themselves, so not rejoining the single market or the customs union, not signing up to freedom of movement, whilst trying to get a closer relationship that they think will be economically and culturally advantageous. A couple of things to mention. There's all sorts of things swirling around in the mix of these negotiations. The EU is very keen on a youth mobility scheme, allowing younger people for a handful of years to be able to come to the UK if they are EU citizens and vice versa. How, if you're the UK government, do you sell that without people saying, well, hang on a minute, is it not effectively freedom of movement? It'll be very interesting to see what the language amounts to in terms of how that is described. Does it involve the word movement at all? Perhaps not. You hear talk of a youth experience, which makes it sound like some sort of theme park or whatever. So there's that into the mix. There is fish. Yes, the splash of déjà vu around those Brexit negotiations returning rather rapidly. Fishing access rights and the extent to which the UK is willing to offer and trade around that. Speaking to people in and around security and defence, is there a security and defence pact? You hear some people making an argument, look, this is a dangerous world, the UK and the EU have more in common than divides them, and where can an arrangement be arrived at? There. But again, with the trade-offs of perhaps there being a lack of willingness to reopen all of those old sort of wounds of Brexit's discussion, whilst at the same time, so the government hopes, perhaps moving to a phase where a conversation can be had with the EU that doesn't immediately start with labels about leavers and remainers and all that kind of stuff. The negotiations are still going on. It looks like the EU ambassadors on the Brussels side of the argument are going to be getting together on Sunday to try and sign something off. The summit itself happens in London on Monday, and there'll be plenty of rhetoric around a closer and, as they see it, a more pragmatic, friendly relationship. But the key thing is going to be the detail, and then the ongoing negotiation that will carry on beyond Monday. I think that US arrangement of a couple of weeks ago, a lot of fanfare, but discussion still to come in the future. I think the same will be the case as far as the EU-UK deal is described too.
Well, it sounds exhausting already, I have to say, Chris. Memories of late-night communiques and the rest of it. But, of course, it comes after a week where the Prime Minister has been very keen to set out his plans on immigration, net migration, legal migration, we would call it, but also talking about his continued conversation on smashing the gangs, illegal or irregular migration. How does that fit in this context of a UK-EU reset?
Yeah, note the sequencing there. So we're getting, as the government would see it, lots of muscular talk this week about migration, legal and illegal, ahead of this EU summit next week, where there will be critics saying, well, hang on a minute, are you not turning on the taps of an element of migration, even if it's limited both in time and by age, as far as youth mobility might be concerned? Therein lie the trade-offs of government, but the sequencing and the language in that context quite interesting. Within government, they are so aware that being seen to deliver secure borders is just key to their credibility, both legal and illegal, and an awareness from the folk I speak to that when you carry out focus groups or just talk to voters around this issue, the two will often collide. You know, the distinction between the two might be limited. So we're going to get some statistics next week on legal migration. There was those record high numbers recently. They are going to fall, but still be high on any sort of longer term trend. And then on illegal migration, this whole business of small boats, record numbers of crossings, and just one of those things where when I speak to people in government, they'll acknowledge it's just that kind of transparent sense of government failure. This government and previous ones not being able to do enough to stop it. We saw the previous government with its Rwanda plan, willing, as it saw it, to try something different and radical because other things, frankly, didn't seem to be working. This government arguing that that was expensive and ultimately a waste of money. And now toying with the idea of having return hubs that are elsewhere, not in the UK, third countries as they're described, where failed asylum seekers, people who have exhausted their legal avenues, could be sent en route to being returned home. The argument being that once you're there, somewhere else, you wouldn't be able to potentially start a family or change your circumstances in a material way that might reopen your case for staying in the UK. Prime Minister's in Albania at the moment, been talking about this. By the way, there isn't going to be a deal with Albania on this specific thing. He's there for a European Political Community Summit, not the EU plus other countries like the UK, that's taking place tomorrow. This is what he said, the Prime Minister, in the last hour or so, on the whole question of migration.
And as I set out in a white paper on immigration that we published on Monday, secure borders are central to our plan for change. And people want and deserve an immigration system that is fair, that works for our national interest, and that restores common sense and control to our borders.
And speaking to folk in government, Jo, being seen to demonstrably deliver secure borders is seen as a central plank for them, ultimately about their governing credibility. We've heard plenty about it this week. It's not going to go away.
Chris Mason, thank you very much. Parth Patel, let's just return to the mobility scheme, the youth mobility scheme, and fear in government, rightly or wrongly, about any talk of freedom of movement and so on and so forth. Should the government be braver? Should they just cast aside any of those fears in 2025 with this reset?
I don't think you should be casting aside those concerns, but I would like them to be braver. Yeah, I think there's a different story you can tell here. And I mean, I was a young person not that long ago.
Good for you.
And there's something about the way politicians and political people talk about young people. Is it about net migration figures? Is it about universities? Is it about labour market shortages in the hospitality sector? No, it's just about young people. And sometimes that matters. Young people are curious. They have a pleasure of finding things out. And there is real value to expanding the imagination by travelling between different countries, engaging with different cultures, learning different languages. And yes, some of that is useful. I've travelled around Europe and I've learned about different ways in which democracies and healthcare systems are organised in Germany versus France. But I've also learned, that most Belgian households have a deep fat fryer plugged into their house next to the kitchen sink, and that's just normal because they love eating chips. And I like the fact that I know that.
All right. Would you want to embrace it, Luke?
Oh, I certainly embrace getting the chance to travel. I remember when I was 18, I went and worked in Australia, for example, for a year.
But would it be freedom? Would it be freedom of movement?
Well, for me, this is the worry that Keir came in on the promise of change and now changes his promises. It's as simple as that. He wrote a letter in 2020 saying how he was all for free movement, and then suddenly we hear an immigration thing saying we've got a border and we're an island of strangers. Now he's talking about tough and having EU schemes where we could have free movement. I don't know whether we're coming or going, and we see this with the farmers, with the council tax.
Let Catherine help you out. Are we coming or going on this?
Our Prime Minister has just delivered a trade deal with India. He's delivered a trade deal with the US, and on Monday I hope that we will see progress in terms of a better deal in our interests, in our national interests with the EU. But it has been consistent that this Labour government has said we will not be returning to join the EU. We will not return to freedom of movement. We are not rejoining the single market or the customs union. But there is so much more work that we can do together in all of our interests.
Madeleine?
Well, the trouble with that is, firstly, I don't think Keir Starmer has been very consistent at all. He's one of the least consistent politicians alive today. And I think that's just provably true. But with the point about the negotiations, I mean, I do worry, especially after the absolute insanity of what has been agreed with Mauritius over the Chagos Islands, that Keir Starmer is not the most bullish when it comes to negotiations. Having more seamless trade with the EU is one thing, but what do you get in exchange for this? And I think there is sometimes a bit of a narrative where we speak as if the EU is always this incredibly reasonable, benevolent entity, when, for instance, we have helped NATO bolster its Eastern Front. We have been at the forefront of support for Ukraine. We've very much been part of European defence and security arrangements, rightly so. given that fact and the fact that they want to continue to have BAA systems, etc., at the table for when we progress forward with defence arrangements, it's astonishing to me that there's literally no one in the EU that, for example, thinks maybe I could have a word with Spain and say, you know, let it go. Gibraltar has been part of Britain since the Treaty of Utrecht. You know, maybe drop that one and let's talk about something else.
You'll have to get on the negotiating team. That's all we have time for today. I will be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15. But thank you to all of my guests today. Bye-bye.